שלום, שבוע טוב. The שיעור is dedicated לעילוי נשמת שמואל בן פסח זיכרונו לברכה, that's Anne's father, for his 35th yahrzeit. חיים ארוכים. And I think it's a proper thing to dedicate a shiur about Rav Moshe Feinstein. I'm sure that's a good עילוי נשמה. Okay, so we speak today about one of the most important Rabbanim, poskim of the last generation. I think it's impossible to exaggerate in the importance of Moshe Feinstein. Of course, if you speak about U.S. Jewry, then he is arguably, but if you have to pick one most important man for the way that the orthodoxy in United States has been shaped, then arguably that would be Moshe Feinstein, an extremely important posek, educator, leader, political leader, and Bezot Hashem, we are going to speak about that. But also in all of the Jewish world, his psikot, his rulings, if you write a tshuva about almost any topic, it's very hard to ignore what was written by Reb Moshe Feinstein. You can agree, you can disagree, but he has a hand almost in any topic that was in his time. Now this shiur would be dedicated to the first half of his life before reaching the United States shores, because that's very easy to focus only on his 40 years, more or less, in the United States. But we have to know that he came as a man of 40 years old, and he did a few very important things already in Europe. So our shiur today would be dedicated for the foundations of how the way it's called making of a gadol. So the making of Moshe Feinstein in Europe. And Bezat Hashem, next week, I hope to speak about his time in America. Hopefully, we would finish that in two shiurim. If there would be a need, then we'd spill over a third one, but I try not to go over two shiurim for one person. So, Moshe Feinstein was born in 1895. 1895, and in the Hebrew date, Zayin Adar. Zayin Adar is an important date because that's the yahrzeit of Moshe Rabbeinu. And that is why he was called Moshe. They called him Moshe because he was born in Zayin Adar. I think nowadays Zayin Adar has fallen a little out of observance, but in Europe, Zayin Adar was a very important day. It would be the day in which they collected for the Chevra Kadisha and for many other institutions of okay, and many more institutions of the Jewish community. So people would fast on Zayin Adar, and then there would be a very nice breakfast meal, meaning breaking the fast. By the Chevra Kadisha, an important day, the Rav would usually give a drasha. Back then, the Rav would not give a drasha every Shabbat night and Shabbat morning. The Rav many times would only give drasha 2 or 3 times a year on Shabbat Shuvah, on Shabbat Hagadol before Pesach, and on Zayin Adar. So it was a very important day, and he's born in Zayin Adar, and he's born, and again, we saw it coming up also in earlier shiurim, and that is that he is born to a very Jewish noble family. Noble, I mean here in terms of Torah. So he's being born to Rav David Feinstein, and obviously you would call one of his children later after his father. You know that Rav David, he just passed away, I think, a few years ago, a couple of years ago. So his father was Reb David Feinstein, who was a fourth generation to Rabbi Avraham, the brother of the Gra. So the brother who was also a very important gaon in his own sake. And he is the fourth generation, all of them Rabbanim, Chashuv people, Chashuv Talmidei Chachamim. He served as a rabbi, his uncles are Rabbanim, his brothers are Rabbanim. So they are, it's a rabbinical, a very important, strong rabbinical family. Also are connected by marriage with the Soloveitchik family. So a very important Jewish Litvish family, strongly connected, not of money. Money was not the point in Lithuania, but of Torah. Also, his mother was, she had the ichus to the Rema, to the Maharshal. So again, a very important family. And he says that in later years, he told that because of the date he was born in and the name that he was given, it was like he was destined for leadership, and he felt it. He was learning with his father in young years till the age of 12. He learned with his father, learned very hard, and very interestingly, his father taught him Tanakh, which was not always the case in Lithuania. His father taught him Tanakh, and to the rest of his life, that's what they, as always, I give the qualification. I am saying what I read, so I cannot grant you it to the truthness of every and each fact I say, but hopefully it's more or less around the truth. So they say that to the rest of his life, he would learn 2 chapters of Tanakh a day. And what 2 chapters of Tanakh a day gives you the ability to finish the Nach about once a year. And very important, very, very special. So he was a great Baki in Tanakh. Again, not all Rabbanim are Bakim in Tanakh. A Rav sometimes can be very Baki in Shas, in Poskim, but he was also extremely Baki in Tanakh because of his father. And they say that at the age of 6 or 7, so he came to the Cheder in order to learn Talmud, to learn Gemara. And they opened the Daf Gemara, and there was the word there in Aramaic, the word is Itmar. Itmar means we have learned. Of course, there are no vowels, there's no nikud in the Gemara. So the Melamed asked the young children, does anyone know how to read this word? And the young Moshe, who knew Tanakh very well, so he knew the word Itamar, not the word Itmar in Aramaic, but the word Itamar in Hebrew, because that was the name of the son of Aaron. So he's raising his hand, and the Melamed asks him to speak, and he says, yeah, I know how to read it, it's Itamar. And all the slightly older children began to laugh. And again, this is a story that he told many years later, and you see that it was burned into him, he remembered it. He said, I learned 2 things that day. One is never give an answer before checking if there may be other angles. Maybe you know the story from one side, but there are other points of view. So I knew this word from Tanakh, but maybe in Talmud it means something else. That was my first lesson. The second lesson is never laugh on the expense of anyone. And they say, obviously, it's not only from this story. I think it was part of his personality and his greatness, but it's very well known about him, his humility. Almost anyone that speaks about him, tells stories about him, returns to the story about his humility and his tzniut. And I think that's a very good example of that. Later, he was also again learning with his father. They say that when he finished at the age of 12 learning with his father, before he was sent to slots, because I would momentarily explain, he already finished with his father 2 sdarim of the Shas. So out of the 6 sdarim of the Shas, he finished 2 sdarim. Let's say that nowadays, if a Talmud in my class, which is in age 19, will tell me that he finished 2 sdarim, I would be extremely pleased. Right? It would be very, very good. Here we speak about the age of 12. So this is a different era and different people. We speak about really geniuses. They say that he was known as a genius child, as a prodigy child, and his uncle was also a rabbi. Once, when the child came into the room, then the uncle gave him cover because he was a gown, the child. So the young, I guess half jokingly, the uncle stood up. And Reb Moshe told later that his father, Reb David Feinstein, asked Moshe, young Moshe, to go out of the room. And he said, I went out of the room, but I could hear because my father was shouting at his brother, at my uncle, you should never do such things. You are ruining the child because you instill ga'ava into his heart. That was, again, that's a story that represents the values that the father aspired to teach young Reb Moshe. In 1907, when he's 12, his father became the Rav of Strauvin. It's all of these places. I didn't say. He was born in Uzda, in the area of Minsk, Minsk is the big city. Nowadays it's Belarus, but back then everything was part of the Russian Empire, and it was part of what was called the Pale of Settlement. Because we remember the Jews were not allowed to live in proper Russia, only if you had a great sum of money, only if you made a great profit to the Tsar. Otherwise, they were exceedingly anti-Semitic, and you were only the Jews were only allowed to live in the west side of Russia, that is in Belarus or Lithuania or Poland, all the areas that the Russians captured later. But in proper Russia, the Jews were not allowed to live. So that was there in Uzda, and Starovin, it's a few kilometers from this Uzda. But now his father was a Rav of a bigger city, he had less time, also he wanted his son to be able to learn with other children of high level, and he sent his son to Slotsk. If you remember, when we learned about Rav Aaron Kotler also learned in Slotsk, but a few years after Reb Moshe. I don't think they overlapped in Slotsk. But they did overlap because both of them saw Rabbi Isser Zalman Meltzer as an important rabbi in their life. Rav Kotler was also married to the family, to the daughter, if I remember correctly, of Rabbi Isser Zalman. But both of them were connected through that, and obviously they would cooperate in America years later. So he's learning in Slotsk for a year, and then he continues with a certain Rav, a young rabbi, Rav Pesach Frumkin. Later he was known as Rabbi Pesach Mikuvrin, because of the yeshiva would open between the wars. But now we are still before World War I, and he is opening this Rav Pesach Frumkin, opened a yeshiva in Sheklov, and Reb Moshe continues to there, and when he's 16, he already finished all of the Shas and all of the Shulchan Aruch, and in the age of 18, his father already asked him to begin to write Shuvot, to Sheilot, and we speak not about the Sheila of what happens if a spoon, not that I has downgrading, but if a spoon fell into a pot, which is easy to answer, speak about heavy questions with a lot of implications. Reb Moshe already is writing answers, and here we already begin to see a very special combination that would be in Rav Moshe Feinstein, and that is a learner, a yeshiva, Bachur, not a Bachur, but after that a rabbi, and a posek. Because in Eastern Europe, many times in that era, these are already separated roles. 200 years before, they were combined. The Khatam Sofer was a Meishiv and he was a Rav of a city. But now, especially in Lithuania, you had places like Volozhin, which were learning, and learning Shulchan Aruch was even looked, it was frowned upon, it was looked down. Why do you learn? You want to be a Rav? Yeah, you should stay in yeshiva and just learn Lishma. That was the approach. So they were it's slightly like a theoretical physicists look at engineers. And they say if you are the real thing, a real deal, you would only learn the theoretical physics. If you are going to make money, then you work as engineer. Right. So that was, but for Moshe Feinstein, this separation would not be part of his life. He would aspire to combine these two different roles of the Meishiv, of the Rav, and of the Yeshiva, of the learner, into one, and that would be, as Be'ezrat Hashem next week, we'll speak more about the type of tshuva, maybe this week we'll see, about the type of tshuva he would give, the style of his responsa. We'll see that came into practice in his Farim. 1914, obviously, First World War breaks. It's in 20th century, it's very clear. Every Jewish person, rabbis or non-rabbis we speak about, would have his own private biography, and then there would be moments in time that you know that the general history would suddenly knock on the door, and you cannot ignore that. And that is, of course, 1914 and 1939 or 1941, depends where exactly you are. These are these type of moments in which private and public become one. You cannot separate them. So in 1914, First World War, breaks out. Communism, after a short while, is taking over in Russia. Yeshivot begin to get closed. Reb Moshe comes back to his parents' home in Starovin. So he leaves the yeshiva is closed, and he goes back to Starovin. 1916, I'm shortening here the process. In 1916, he is getting into the draft, right? He's being recruited to the army, and he doesn't want to be recruited to the army. Neither if it's the Tsarist army or the communist army, he doesn't want to be part of neither one of them. However, there was a ruling that, I guess that was still the Tsarist, there was a ruling that if you are a clergy and you are, if you serve as a clergy, then basically you'd be exempt from the draft. So he is a single, age of 21. That's very unusual. But he becomes the Rav of Uzda, where he was born. Now, formally he's the Rav. He doesn't see himself as the Rav because he feels that he's not appropriate to be the Rav because he's single, because he's young, because he still maybe doesn't know enough. I would have the gamble that he knows more than most of the Rabbanim around, but that's how he felt. However, if excuse me, we have very little of his tshuvot that he answered there. Unfortunately, in 1922, he was still in Russia. He was walking with a suitcase with more than 300 responses that he written. I guess that he was preparing them for print, and someone stole the suitcase. I'm sure that the person stealing was not interested in the tshuvot. He was interested in the suitcase. But we can only imagine that all of these responses were just thrown to some river, and he was devastated. He writes about that later. It happened on Asara B'Tevet, and he saw that as part of the punishments of Asara B'Tevet, the suffering of Asara B'Tevet. So we have very, very little that survived from that time in his life, but still just to understand what is the atmosphere where he serves his first Rabbanut. So if you can please pass these pages, I would also share it in the Zoom. Okay, so the first source is from the Egot. Is Egot Moshe is well-known responsa, and this is from the first section. בעניין רצון בקידושין ועדים כופרים. So what happens if there is a question about the willingness of the Khatan and the Kala to participate in a wedding, and the people that are there, to the witnesses, they are כופרים. כופרים here means either that they deny that they have been there, or כופרים means that they are אפיקורסים. So let's see. ענף א', עובדא עתה לידי באוזדא. So that's an event that happened to me or came to me in Uzda, שנת תרע"ז, that's 1917. בחודש מנחם האב. איך שבקיבוץ נערים פוחזים לשחוק. So there was a gathering of youth, פוחזים. How would we translate פוחזים? These are empty, vain youth. And they were gathering in order לשחוק, in order to play. לקח אחד יד נערה אחת, so one of the boys took the hand of a certain girl, ונתן עליה טבעת, and put a ring on her finger, ואמר לה, הרי את מקודשת לי. So yeah, a genius. And he put a ring on her finger, and he said, you are מקודשת לי, הרי את מקודשת לי, ולא השליכה מידה. She liked the ring, or for whatever reason, she didn't throw immediately the ring. והיו שם שני נערים, also there were two witnesses. Now what was the type of these witnesses? חשודים בעריות, so they themselves were suspected on improper behavior. It's questionable behavior. ובחילול שבת, they were also breaking the Shabbat. והרבה איסורים, but that was not the only ones. I will not give you, he says, the whole list. הרבה איסורים. אחד מהם למד בגימנזיות בעת ממשלת הקיסר במינסק. Now he writes that already in America when he edits the tshuva, but he says back then one of these witnesses was also learning in the Russian high school in the time of the Tsar. That again doesn't make him into a great Talmid Chacham, would say that. וגם את שניהם מחזיקים לכופרים, האחד בהרבה מעיקרי הדת, השני לכופר בגאולתנו על ידי משיח בן דוד שבמהרה בימינו ועוד עיקרים. So these two witnesses, one was complete כופר and the other only 5 out of the 13, let's say. Now, these are the type of people that he was dealing with in all that, but you have to understand that is what is happening to the Jewish people in Russia, and it happens very quick. At least for some people, maybe some people with very, very far vision were able to see this process already in the middle of the 19th century. But for many, many old school Jews, things were suddenly completely collapsing. If some of you maybe know the writings of Shalom Aleichem, of Tevye, the milkman, right? And you see, this is a completely old schooled Jew, and his daughters are all over the place. And he doesn't even understand what is going on. That's a very good example. So I'm back to the responsa. שלחתי אחריהם. So Moshe, again, he's a young man. He's 21, 23 himself. And he's sending to call the witnesses. I guess that the girl came because usually what happens, the girls suddenly understand that she's in a problem. If she would want to get married, she's now stuck with this first guy. So he is now trying to get her free. So he called these witnesses. בא לפניי רק אחד מהם, והשני שלומד בגימנסיה במינסק לא רצה לבוא ולא שמענו ממנו כלום. So one of the witnesses, the guy from the Gimancia, he is not even interested from the high school. He doesn't come before a rabbi. He's, he's past that. So he's out of the game. The first one, I guess the one that only is epicurus in 4 or 5 out of the 13 ikarim. So he was willing to come. זה שבש אמר, ששמע איך שאמר להרי את מקודשת. He says, yeah, I heard the guy giving the ring, did say, הרי את מקודשת לי, אף העיד שהיה זה רק לשחוק וליצנות בעלמא. But he says, that was game, that was for laugh, that was not serious. משום שאי אפשר, כפי שמכיר אותם, שנערה זאת תתרצה להינשא לנער זה, וידוע היה שהוא רק לשחוק בעלמא, so the guy was not in the league of the girl, so obviously the whole thing was only a game, מחמת ששיחקו שם הנערים והנערות, it was a game between the boys and the girls, ולא נתכוונו לשם קידושין. וגם אמר שכך חשב גם העד השני, and he also testifies that the other witness, the guy that doesn't even wish to come, he also thinks it's only a game, ולא היה אצלם כלל ספק בזה, there was no doubt, ולא החזיקו כלל לדבר שידברו, they never even spoke about that again, because the whole thing for them was just an episode, it was just a game. וזה ששתקה ולא השליכה, או גם נתנה ידה, and he says, the witness says, I don't even remember, did she only was quiet, or maybe she sent her hand, ומחמת שרצתה לשחוק ולהתלוצץ. So the girl also participated in the game, but she was not serious. וכן מחזיקים מי ששומע הדבר שאי אפשר שתתרצה להינשא לזה, והיא אומרת גם כן שרצתה לשחוק ולהתלוצץ. So everyone says, the relatives, and everyone says it was only a game. But you understand the problem. A game is a game, but you gave a ring and you said, הרי את מקודשת לי. So how do we differentiate between a game and a serious kiddushin? It's a long answer. By the way, אגרות Moshe are long. That's not the type of response that is short, it's long. Again, I hope to speak about why he's using this specific style later. These are not, they are long and usually, at least to me, they are not easy to read. They are not easy to follow. He is making circles, he is going this way and that way, and explain why he can go this way. He doesn't only share the conclusions. He takes you with him the whole road, but the road may be long and hard. So here I skipped the whole משא ומתן, which is a few pages, and I immediately came to the bottom line. ולכן בעובדא דידן, he says, according to all that we have spoken about, אין לחוש כלל, which there is no fear, there is no problem. אף אם העד היה חושב שכיוונה לחידושין, even if this witness would have thought it's קידושין. וכל שכן שהעד אומר שברור לו שלא כיוונה לקידושין שתהיה נאמנת, וגם לדידי מסתבר, he says, it's also, to me it's clear, שאף ושני עדים שאומרים שלפי ידיעתם אותם אי אפשר תתרצה להתקדש, if they all know and the witnesses say that it cannot be that these women intended for the קידושין to be valid, אינם קידושים כלל, ולכן מכל עליהן טעמים התרתי אישה זו לעם, because of all of these reasons, I allowed her without a get, which again may be very important, if she wants to marry a Kohen, then even if the guy agrees to give a get, then that would forbid her to marry a Kohen. So it was very important that you would completely disqualify this whole נישואים, marriage, and that's what he did. So you see, he's a guy, 21 years old, again a single in some city, and he gives a ruling. That's not a Schul's rabbi ruling. That's a question that you would usually refer to a higher authority. It's a question of העריות, of כריתות, of eshet ish. That's a very complicated sheila. In the age of 21, he is already feels qualified, not only feels, you would read the tshuva. He is qualified to give a tshuva even to this type of questions. Okay, but you also see the type of environment he is operating with. It's not the yeshiva in Slotsk anymore. 1919, they abolish the draft. I guess the World War I is over, and the communists are now in control, and they decide that they abolish the draft. And so Rav Moshe doesn't want to be the Rav anymore. In Uzda, as I said, he didn't feel that he was really the Rav. He was only formally the Rav. So he leaves Uzda, and he comes back to his parents' home at Starvin. 1921, his mother passes away, and he gets a job in another city named Luban, where he would stay from 1921 to 1937. For the next 16 years, he would be in this Luban, which is an important city, and he moves there. He's still single. In Lag BaOmer of that year, there is a big pogrom in Luban. Now, again, I think we said it a few times here in this shiurim. Because of World War II, no one remembers what happened in World War I and its consequences, and between the wars, and all the tzarot are being pushed aside because of the big tzara that happened in World War II because of the Holocaust. However, life were not pink and sweet in Eastern Europe between the wars. There is a reason why almost 2 million Jews emigrated from Eastern Europe to the United States. It's not because it was happy and fun in Eastern Europe. So there was a pogrom. Skel is hardly is able to save his life. In 1922, he marries with Sima Kostenovich. She was the daughter of the Rosh HaKahal in Luban, and the daughter of the Shoichet, and they have 5 children. One of them called Pesach Chaim after his rabbi. You remember Pesach Funkin. So Pesach Chaim died as a young boy, which back then was just things that could happen. And the other 4 were 2 girls, Feya, I hope that I pronounce the name right, Shifra, and the 2 boys, David, after his father, and Reuven. Again, both David Feinstein and Reuven Feinstein both became famous rabbis in their own sake. Now, these 16 years are a very important period in his life. He wrote some of his most important responsa. He's becoming very well known. People now send letters from all around Europe to this rabbi in this godforsaken Luban in Russia. Just as an example to an answer he gives in Luban, source bet. בעניין בלמבה, or plambe, that is the feeling in the tooth. Oh. So you need a feeling in the tooth, right? That's a medicine even begin to comes to Russia. So they are now have feelings in the tooth, and it's temporary. There can be a constant feeling, and there can be a temporary one. Now, why would we care about feelings in the tooth? Obviously, for a mikveh, right? There is a problem when you immerse in the mikveh. You need there to be nothing on the body that would stop the water from reaching. So the question now, if something is part of the body, it's part of the body. But if it's something that is temporary, that gives a question: is it a problem with the mikveh or not? So that's the answer that he gives. בעניין פלמבה זמנית, שהוא סתימה בנקב השן לזמן, which is, he explains in Hebrew, right, it is stima. If anyone here had been with a tooth doctor here in Israel, then a dentist, stima, that's how they call it, right, this feeling. אם הוא חציצה, that's an answer from י"ט מרחשוון, תרפ"ט. תרפ"ט is 1929. 1929, because it's Marcheshvan, then maybe it's 1928. And you can see it's Luban, And the answer is addressed, מעלת כבוד אחי אהובי הגאון הגדול, מורנו רב מרדכי שליט"א, הגאון of בעדין שקלוב. So that's an answer he sends to his own brother in שקלוב. ענף א', בדבר פלם ב', שמניחים לסתום בנקב השן על משך חודש ויותר. So this temporary feeling can sometimes be for more than a month. ואחר כך מחליפים אותה על אחרת שתישאר, and then you replace it with something that would stay constant. נסתפקת לעניין חציצה. So the question was about does that create a problem with חציצה, with immersing in the מקווה, וכתבת ג' טעמים להיתר, ואתה רוצה לידה דעתי ענייה בזה, so his brother already gave 3 reasons why to be makel, but the brother also felt that he wants a stample from the great Gaon Reb Moshe. Now again, I skip here the whole answer, which is long, and he finishes saying, יש להתיר לפי זה גם בפלמבה שלא הניח הרופא בטוב. So even he says if the plumber doesn't sit good, because that is another question, because if it doesn't sit good, you need to correct it. If you need to correct it, that means that you don't want it there. So that makes it more of a problem. He says even that we can be making, because right now it is for that sake, and also because it's inside the mouth, and inside the mouth it can be more makel than something that is outside. Again, we cannot right now go into all of the halachic details, but that's an extremely fundamental tshuva. They use it to this day, because this is a type of a question that comes all the time, not only with plumbing. Because of modernization in the medicine, then everything, every few months, I would say, even you have a new shayla with the ears, with the mouth, with the nose, different type of things they put in different places, and these are questions that you need to be able to give an answer. And the analysis that he does in this tshuva, and also obviously the cadence, because when you have someone like Moshe Feinstein that you can rely on, and this makel, that's a very important tshuva. And so he says, even the plumber that the doctor didn't put right, וגם בסתימת מוח לבד, so even if he only put, it's not even a feeling, it's only some type of a bud, of a cotton or something that he put inside. This is a question that happens many times with ears. Women that have problem of going to the mikveh because they have ears infection. So again, can you use cotton? Obviously, we do not give psika here, but this is, you see that these are questions that are arising, and he is treating them. אם הוא בתוך הנקב אינו מכסה השן, זה לא כחוכמת אדם. He says, I know that there are earlier tshuva that were more מחמיר, and we speak here about mikveh, that's one of the most difficult issues to be makel on. And he says, again, this is tough ratio 1922, so he's what, 30 something. So as a rabbi of 30 something years, he is disputing the halacha that was pasken by the Chochmat Adam, one of the most important poskim of the generation before, even 2 generations before. And again, he was an independent, no question about that, an independent thinker. And he is giving here a tshuva להקל. He says, עדיין למעשה צריך עיון וקשה לסמוך, אבל פלום בטובה אף זמנית מותרת בבירור. So in the end about the cotton is unsure. This is about the feeling, even if it is temporary, you can rely, והשם יעזרנו שלא ניכשל חס וחלילה בדבר הלכה. It's interesting. It doesn't end always with this type of a sentence, but it says, God shall help us that we will not fail in words of halacha. אחיך אהובך בלב הנפש, so your brother who loves you with all heart and soul, Moshe Feinstein. So that's an answer from Luban, and there are many more important answers. I just ran a search in the sponsor project. They got Moshe. I typed the word Luban. It came out with more than 200 responses from his time, 16 years in Luban. Okay, so things are going along. You know, again, it was not great, but you couldn't leave. However, again, general history intervenes. Because in the beginning, after the communists took hold of Russia, Lenin was in control, and Lenin decided to go for the new economic policy, the NEP, which I hope that that's the word. NEP, yeah, NEP, the new economic policy, in which he did allow, against the communist ideology, he did allow some private entities to exist, because they understood that otherwise the whole thing would collapse, as would happen in the future. But Lenin was maybe less rigid, I don't know, but he decided that he would allow for private, and also he allowed for religion to exist for a time. So for a short while it seemed that it's bad but manageable. You know, that's always the problem. Because if things go immediately bad, then you run away. But if things go bad slowly, it's like the frog in the cooking pot. So they believed that they would be able to manage. However, in 1928, then the NEP is already over, and it's not Lenin anymore, it's Stalin, and a part of the economic problems, which were great, and people died out of hunger. But this is not something to laugh at. That was something horrible that was happening. But a part of that, he was strengthening the power of the central government. This is very nice words to say that basically he was torturing, killing, arresting, sending people to re-education, and all that we know about the Stalin regime. These are not necessarily the pickiest, but this machine is already working. 1928 and the beginning of the 30s. And also he is persecuting religion. Not necessarily Jews, by the way. He was anti-Semitic, no question, but he was happy to hate everyone. So he didn't only persecute the Jews, he also persecute the Christians. And he's closing all religious institutions. So Chederim are closed because they are destroying the source of the children. You need to educate the children at the right scientific path, which is obviously the communist one. And there is no place in communist Russia for a cheder of not the old type, not the new type, not any cheder at all. So the chadarim are being closed, yeshivot are being closed, shuls, many of them are being closed. Some of them remain only so the communists would be able to supervise those rabbis and Jews that still are in the fold. So that's just as again an example. Source Gimel. That's a response that Reb Moshe wrote in 1979. So that is 50 years later. He writes a response. And it's it's not an obscure, but it's a very minute detail. It's about someone, let's imagine that there is a Chag which happens on Shabbat, right? Or a Chag that happens on Rosh Chodesh. Excuse me, a Shabbat that happens on Rosh Chodesh. And someone, which I guess is slightly confused, so he davened, but he only said the Shabbat part, but not the Chag, or not the Rosh Chodesh. So he needs to repeat. However, when he repeated, now he only said the Rosh Chodesh, he didn't say the Shabbat. Okay, everything can happen. So this guy sends the question to Reb Moshe Feinstein. Reb Moshe Feinstein says, I think it's fine. I think it's fine. Because in the end, in the conclusion, he had both the Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh. It's a very interesting answer. We can go depth into that, but obviously that's not what you're going to do now. So he says it's fine. And then he says, I look from the middle. He says, Mistaber sheyatza. You see, go down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines from the beginning. So in the beginning of the 6th line, it says Mistaber sheyatza. So it's fine. Yatza, Yotze Zayin, as they say. Okay, it's not great, but he completed his commitment. But then he says, V'chen oreti b'Liuban. Suddenly he remembers, 50 years later. He says, I gave the same instruction in Liuban. Now, why is it? In Liuban people were extremely confused and were saying one fila and then the other fila. No. He says, כשחטפו אנשים והושיבום בבית האסורים כדי שיותן כסף של זהב למדינה כפי הסך שעמדו שיש לו. So in Liuban he says, the communists were requiring taxes, very high taxes from the Jews. And if someone didn't pay, he would go to jail until they would pay for him. So a guy will throw him into jail, והיאז שבת וראש חודש שבט, רב משה remembers that 50 years later, so it was שבת ראש חודש שבט. ולא הניחו להביא סידור. Obviously the communists would not allow him to bring a sidur into that would defile the communist prison, to bring a sidur in. So they did, if someone remember, Natan Sharansky and his war in order to get Filin into a communist prison. And that is later when it was more liberal. So he says that they didn't let him to bring a sidur into the prison. And he didn't remember by heart. He could daven Shabbat by heart, but not the Rosh Chodesh. So Reb Moshe gave him the answer when they were taking him into jail. Reb Moshe told him, daven what you remember, that is the Shabbat, and I would make sure that we, on Shabbat, would collect the money to get you out of jail. And then when he went out of jail, he told him, now you should say only the Rosh Chodesh. That's the answer here. שיאמר תפילת מוסף של שבת שבקהיל אומרה בעל פה, כי אין מוספי ראש חודש מעכבים מוספי שבת, ולכן אין מעכבים גם בתפילות, ואם יוציאו אותו לחופשי אחר כך, בו ביום, if he would be able to be released, the same day, יתפלל מוסף של ראש חודש. מוסף של ראש חודש אולי טוב יותר לומר של ראש חודש לבד, maybe it would be even better to mention only ראש חודש. At the second tefillah, and then he debates this point. So the point is, as I said, it's a very minute detail. But the episode, the historical episode, is telling, and you see again that he remembers that 50 years later, how he had to give this psak for people that were taken into the jail.
They would collect the money on Shabbat
Yeah, because being in the jail was considered a pikuach nefesh.
Next question.
No question, you say.
In Russian.
Yeah, no question, yeah.
Your gap, he's writing it.
In 1979.
He remembered.
Yeah, he remembers.
He remembered what he wrote then.
There was a new question. Someone just was confused. Is someone davening in the Lower East Side and is confused with the tefillah? I think this answer is not to, I think this is an answer to Memphis, to Rav Ephraim Greenblatt, to the Rebbe of Ephraim. It's a well-known Rav in the United States. I think it's an answer to him. It's a response to him in Memphis. So someone in Memphis is mistaken with the tefillah. And the Moshe gives an answer. And he says, you know what? I was asked this question 50 years ago in Luban under this type of circumstances. Now, you know what I need maybe? No, I think it's Tashlach. It's 1979. Yeah. Okay. They were closing, as I said, the Chadarim, the yeshivot. They were closing the mikvah. About the Bet Knesset. Another question. That is source Dalet. To give some picture of what was going on. Yud Zayin Iyar Taf Reish Tzadik Hey. So that is Iyar 1935. 1935. Bimei Tirda Gdola Hashem Yerachem. So it's the great distress in Luban. Now again, knowing what would happen in 4 years, this distress would look like a children play. But back then, that was considered obviously very, very difficult. מעלת כבוד ידידי הרב הגאון המפורסם, מורי ורבי הרב שמעון טרבניק שליטה. So he is writing again to another Rav. בדבר מה שנסתפק כבוד תורתו הרמה. בייחדו, שימסרו להם לענייני פריצות בית כנסת אחד. ובאם לא ייתנו להם, יחפשו טוענות ועלילות במיסים ודרישות תיקונים בהוצאות גדולות, שלא יהיה אפשר, עד שיוכרחו להניח להם לקחת את שתי בתי הכנסיות שבעיר. So, they came to the Rav of the city that he is writing to. It's not necessarily the communist, it's the communist, but there was a special מחלקה, a special section called the Yiv Section. These were Yiv Section, Yiv is Yid, and Section, section. The Yiv Section were Jews that were responsible on the Jews, on their brothers. But as happens always with this type of meshumadim, and it doesn't matter if someone is meshumad for Christianity or for Islam or for communism. He needs to prove that he's more communist than Stalin himself. So they were persecuting their brothers to the most degree that they could. Then because they knew, because they themselves learned in Chadarim, you couldn't hide from them. They knew all the tricks and the shticks. So in that case, they came to the local rabbi. The rabbi there had 2 shuls. And they told him, you can either give us one of these shuls. He says, lepritzut. I'm not sure what they mean. It may be to make him into a theater, to make him into some, that's a public institution. So that is how it's called nationalization. Right? So they expropriate it. That's what the communists do. So we want to take it. You would either give us willingly, and you can choose. We give you the ability to choose what shul you want to give us, or we would make such taxes and laws that you need to repair. Meaning we would say that your shuls are they're risky, not safe to public use. You would need to fix them. You'd not be able to collect the money, and then you take both shuls. So either you give us willingly one of them and you choose which one. Oh, now you can, that's sadistic mind. That is a sadistic mind. And that's what they said. So the Rav asked Reb Moshe, that's right, that would be later. But obviously that would be more difficult. But here it's in truth. So that's, I don't know. I don't even want to think about it. So that was the choice. So the Rav asked Rav Moshe, can I choose which shul would be desecrated, or should I, because I'm not allowed to give a shul over for desecration, it's better for me not to do anything, and then they would take both shuls. So that's the choice, and that's an amazing answer. Again, he obviously in command of every text and everything of Chazal, and he gives proofs from when they ask for a certain Jew to be given over and kill him. Should you give, or should all the city be killed? Should you, when they want to defile a woman? So he has all of these type of parallels that he's debating if they are similar or not. And then he says, he concludes, I'm in the second, turn over to the second side. And the first line, after the three dots. מותר ביחדו בית הכנסת פלוני למוסרו להם כדי להציל בתי כנסיות. He says it is allowed to choose one of the shoes and give it over in order to save the others. וכל שכן בעובדא זו שכתב כבר תורתו רמה, שכבר סגרו העיר, they even closed one of the shoes. So it's not functioning anymore. כדי לתלנה בעצמם עד שהתקבצו חתימות. Now again, they wanted most of the Jews to sign that they agree to give the shoe. That's, as I said, that's sickening. And they say you would sign that you willingly give over the shul. It says anyhow, so it's a done deal, and you can allow them to do that. If they בלא ייחדו בית הכנסת אסור ייתן להם בידיים. And then he says, I skip over, I'm 4 lines from the end. He says, וכבר היה עובדא אצלי בשנת תרפ"ט. He tells this rabbi, the rabbi asked him in 1935, and he says, 6 years ago I had the same story. So that's a method by the Yivsektia. ולא הנחתי ליתן בידיים. He says, I had this story, but to me they didn't tell me what shoe they want, and they didn't close one of the shoes before, so I was willing to get go of the 2 shoes in order not to collect signatures in order to close one of the shoes. And he says, but anyhow, you should know, that's how he concludes. He says, anyhow, you should know, they are liars, they lie through their teeth, and they will take the second shoe anyway. Just a question of time. He says that you should know that it's an interesting theoretical discussion, but practically they will take the other shoe. It's a question of when it would happen, not if would it happen.
Yes, it did. They did.
They did. And they did, for sure. For sure. For sure. They closed the mikvaot, as I said. I would speak about it in a second. They decided that rabbis are, obviously they are anti-communist element. And so they said, if you want to continue to be a rabbi, you need to pay for the damage that you cause, you need to pay the Russian government 7,000 rubles a year. That was most beyond, obviously, even the salary of the Rav. So, what damage?
Yeah.
That you...
Moral damage.
Ideological damage. So many rabbis had to close shop because you cannot. So anyhow, people were starving food. So how can you survive? You have to pay 7,000 rubles. Moshe Feinstein collected money. He said, not because I want to remain a rabbi, because it would be chilul Hashem if you would let them close the rabbanut. So he collected money in order to be able to pay the tax. And then they had a law that apartment in which rabbis are teaching, so these are also unlawful residential areas. So they took, so he was at one home, they took it, he moved to another home, they took it as well. He went to live with a certain old, they say, shoe carpenter, it's called sandlar. Cobbler, with an old cobbler that allowed him and his family to stay with him at his home. That was the situation in 1935. As I said, they closed the mikvah. There is another extremely interesting answer about the mikvah. That is from 1933, source A. They closed the mikvah. They didn't allow it. They said it's unhealthy. It's a health hazard. So they closed the mikvah. So he went to the architect of, they had a public bath house because people didn't have baths in their homes. So he went to the goish, a public bath, and I guess they bribed him or something, and they were able to convince the architect to put some changes into the pipe, into the things there, in order for it to be according to some dochak shita. Somehow, maybe you can be lenient. However, his wife, which, as I said, she was very full herself, she didn't want to go to this mikvah. He told her, you have to go at least one a month, so the other women would see that it's kosher. Otherwise, they would say the Rav does not rely on this hater. They would not rely, and they would not be able to stand it, and the whole thing would fall apart. So she went once a month, but they did not live together. I mean, they were not together for 5 years. From 1932 to 1937 when he left Russia. That's the type of situation. They say that that's a story by his son, so I guess that can be relied. And they say that the students came to him. One or two students heard that they do not rely on this kula, and they went to him and they asked, should they also be machmir on themselves? So first they say, it's not my own chumrah, it's my wife's chumrah. I think you can rely. And secondly, he says, we got married when we thought that chumrot are possible. So the contract between me and my wife is that we rely on, we go for chumrah and we do not rely on leniencies. However, you got married when things, there were students, there was young, you got married where the communists were already in power. So you got married on, because obviously things were going down, so you got married, the contract is that you can rely on leniencies. And that's the psika that he gave them. You see here how sensitive he was to human issues. And again, that's a feature that would be very, very important also later when he would come to the United States.
But not only feature, on the circumstances of life, what is going on in reality.
Yeah, exactly.
Much more. Yeah, you
do not close yourself to what is going on. Yeah, for sure. He was very, very much aware. So you'd see that the one of the questions that arose in source A when the mikvahs were closed. We are already 10. Wow. Okay, I will not read it inside. I will just say that the Eusekia knew that they are using the public bathhouse. They began to send a Jewish woman to hit the public bathhouse on Shabbat. He says only on Shabbat they would hit it. By hit. On Chilul Shabbat, with Chilul Shabbat. So the Jewish women would not be allowed to enjoy the Chilul Shabbat and would not be allowed to use the bathhouse as a mikvah. That's the level that they descended into. So he has a whole answer in which he goes into details in order to allow that as well. But that's how things were going on. But most of the Jews, we have to know, the state of Judaism was very weak even before communists came into power. But they give it the push that was needed in order to completely, that the whole house of cards would collapse down. And many, many young Jews went with communism. That was the ideology of the future. That was redemption.
But it wasn't, I'm sorry to interrupt, it wasn't another choice.
And also there was no choice.
At my family, my grandpa went to America, he established business, everything was successful. He came back to pick up his family. In 14 wars started.
And got stuck.
And in 20, the closed borders, that's it.
That's it.
You're
completely right. No, I don't blame anyone.
No,
just how things happened. And also they closed the chadarim, so there was no yeshiva, there was no chinuch. So they did all they could to completely shut down everything that is Jewish, and they succeeded to a large degree. They succeeded, and things were falling apart. There's another answer in Luban that's in source Vavir. Again, I wouldn't read it. You can read it later yourself. And that is a question he got from Moscow. And he says there are fathers there that they are still Torah observants, but their children are not, and they are old. so they cannot live by themselves anymore. They come to live with the children. But they ask, can we eat? Our daughter-in-law says that the food they prepare for us, obviously the kitchen was not kosher, but there was a few utilities that were kept for the old father, which is still, meshuga in his ways and wants to keep kosher. But can you rely on someone that herself has no regard to kashrut? Moshe discussed that. No, that's not one of his longest answers. It's not a very long answer, but discuss it at length. And he comes down it smoother. He says, if you know that even that on kashrut they are completely, and they are epikosim, they do not keep anything, but you know that they are honest people, and they would not deceive their own father, you can rely on that. He says, if you are weak and sick. Obviously, if you are healthy, you shouldn't rely on that. But if you are weak and sick, you can rely and eat and rely on your daughter-in-law that says that she keeps the food kosher for you. That is answer. That is from Tafresh Tzadik Dalet. That is from 1934. 1934. But you can see how everything goes down the tubes. Because if you have a restaurant or anything kosher, there is no need for this type of leniencies. You only need them when you cannot, there is no kosher food anymore. You just cannot eat. So you give whatever hate or whatever leniency that you can give. And luckily you have someone in the stature of Moshe Feinstein who can really find this type of heterim. In 1937, after his children were banned by the local Yevsektia to join his Lela Seder, they said, you are ruining the soul of the children. That was the final straw. And he and his wife decided they would leave for America. And that is the story that we will tell Be'ezrat Hashem next week.
That was
37.
How's they gonna let him go?